back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thanks for tuning into the second hour of the show. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by SoulHealer.com and can be heard every Thursday evening here live on the Inception Radio Network. Don't forget to check out the Just Energy Radio page, www.justenergyradio.com, and sign up for our weekly newsletter. And if you weren't here for the first hour this Saturday, I'll be doing a book signing in Plano, Texas, starting at 3 o'clock at the Barnes & Noble in Plano. And then on June 15th and 16th, I'll be speaking at the Alchemy event in California. It's alchemy.com. And then I'll be in New York next month doing some book signings. And so check out the webpage, www.justenergyradio.com, and it has information of all these upcoming events. And Jamie, if you could mute yourself, because there's like all static on here.
Actually, I am muted, but I'll try it.
Oh, it's a little better. Much better. Okay, so now we have my first hour guest on for the second hour, because we just did like a little presto changeo switcheroo on you. But we're all good, because now we're going to talk about the Christian conspiracy, the suppressed teachings of Jesus. Ooh. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about Joseph and get him on the air. Beginning in his 20s, Joseph immersed himself in the study of theosophy for several years, which included studies of Gnostic doctrines. He became intrigued with the real story of Jesus and his original doctrines and began uncovering the hidden teachings of Jesus, all of which had been suppressed by the Christian fathers. So the author of The Orthodox Christian Conspiracy, Joseph Macchio. Hey, Joseph, how are you?
Oh, I'm great. Yes, I'm great.
Okay, Joseph?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you good now.
Okay. Good.
Since you're on the show for the first time, maybe give us a little bit of background, how you became interested in studying the development of Christianity and theology in the first place.
Well, I always knew from many years ago that there was something actually missing in the Christian message. It didn't all make sense to me. The original sin, and trying to find out really who Jesus was. And when I began researching for Summit University Press for the Summit Lighthouse on the book The Lost Years of Jesus, which I did some research for, I began to be even more intrigued. And this went on for many, many years. The Lost Years of Jesus, of course, by Elizabeth Clare Prophet, actually states that Jesus went to the East between the ages of 13 and 29. And he studied in India, and he studied in Persia, and studied Buddhism as well. And, of course, this book was originally published by a guy called Nicholas Notovich way back in the 1890s. And, of course, that was ignored by the church. Although, interestingly enough, a cardinal told Mr. Notovich that there were 63 some-odd manuscripts in the Vatican discussing Jesus' journey to the East. And so you get a picture of Jesus, which is not like a God come down to earth, but a man, a spiritual man, searching. So I decided to search even deeper and found out from different texts and books, including Holger Kirsten's very fine book, Jesus Lived in India, that Jesus, in fact, lived a longer life. And as I began to see hints and read articles and look at books, I decided that I should try or make an attempt to put everything together in one book, if possible. And then, of course, I started developing an interest in the Gnostic library, the Nag Hammadi library of Gnostic texts, which, again, spoke about some very amazing things. There was the understanding of the pre-existence of the soul, And there was the understanding of reincarnation, and there was the understanding of various forces of evil. So this went on for many years, and finally, I decided to just write my own book, which also took many years, and put it all together. So a lot of what I've written in the Orthodox Christian Conspiracy is not necessarily original, but rather a compilation of many things that people have ignored in the Christian world, basically. And I came to the conclusion, as many others have, that many, many church fathers suppressed the original message, which was basically Gnostic.
Well, we're going to get into that whole part. Hopefully, I mean, your book is it is just jam-packed, cover to cover, with information. Very impressive. Very impressive. But the general belief is that the books that are in the Bible, the canonized books of the New Testament and the epistles and whatever else is in the Acts and the epistles, were the first writings that came out of the new Christian sect. And when you start talking about some of the texts that you find in the Nag Hammadi library, like the Pistis Sophia or the Book of Mary Magdalene or the Book of Thomas, that they were all much later writings and they should be ignored. So how do you deal with that? What is your response to something like that?
Well, certain scholars like Helmut Kester, for instance, actually come out and says that the Gospel of Thomas is actually older. The four Gospels that we don't have actually originals of those Gospels. They were decided upon by a church father called Irenaeus as being the only authentic Gospels. There were many, many, many Gospels that were back from the 1st century, coincident with what we know as the four Gospels. So I don't really hold to the idea that the Gospels are the oldest. And in fact, the epistles of Paul are even older than the canonical Gospels. Or maybe Mark probably is the oldest. Of course, there was a secret Gospel of Mark, too. Now, a lot of scholars are coming to the conclusion. Now, Pistis Sophia is supposed to be 3rd century, and it's 3rd century. The Coptic translation is 3rd century. Nobody really knows how old that is because the Coptic was based upon a Greek one. Now, in terms of the four Gospels, the oldest complete set of the Gospels we have, in other words, in their entirety, only go back to the 4th century. So if your oldest sources are 4th century, now we have excerpts from John's Gospel that is like 150 A.D., but taken as a whole, they're 4th century, you see. So there were so many different communities that had different books, and of course on one of the pages of the book I list all of these different texts that were, Gospel of Perfection, the Gospel of Andrew, the Gospel of the Nazarene, the Gospel of the Ebionites, and anyone who's read, like you mentioned, the Nag Hammadi library, the Gospel of Thomas is very old, but it presents a totally different Jesus than the Orthodox Jesus.
So you mentioned, kind of going along with this, which I thought was interesting, that the Vatican actually had 63 of these original documents, or some large number.
Yes. Yeah, that's what this Cardinal told Nicholas Notovich when he published his book, The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ.
Wouldn't you just love to get into the Vatican underground and go touching and looking through all their stuff?
Why not really give the true story of Jesus? See, there's so much of a cover-up, and, it's taken me 500 some odd pages to delineate the entire story, which is extremely detailed. And, the Pistis Sophia, you have the Apocalypse of James, you have all these different texts. I don't necessarily hold, as I said before, that they are very recent, that they are more recent than the Gospels. I think they're around the same time. When you consider the Gospels, as we have them, were written between, 70 all the way up to about 97, 98 with John's Gospel. I think at the same time, the other writings were written, that Valentinus wrote, the Gospel of Truth, and so forth.
I mean, do you think that they were actually written, or do you think that they were just well entered into the oral tradition of the sect?
Well, I think a lot of it started with oral, but, we know that Mark wrote 2 Gospels. One was, the regular Gospel of Mark, and then there was the secret Gospel of Mark. So we know that there was a lot of stuff. We know that one of the teachers that I talk about, Cerinthus, had a secret Gospel of Matthew, which Jerome, the church father, said, well, I have to translate this, and it's not very easy because it's written in Hebrew characters. But yet, he suppressed that one and went for the canonical Matthew in Greek.
So any thoughts as to why they decided to pick those books and X out all of the other ones? I mean, I've read parts of the Pista Sophia, and that one, even to me, in contemporary times, seems a little bit out there. Even though it's one of the ones that I want to sit down and actually, read it, not just kind of scroll through it. But why do you think they got rid of them? What was their motive or agenda?
That is one of the reasons why I wrote this book, and I think that, as Elaine Pagels also agrees, some of it was for political reasons. The secret teaching of Jesus, which is what they wanted to get rid of, really empowers the believer, mankind, with access to the divine self, with access to Christhood. Now, everyone has the potential to be a Christ, having a divine spark within the heart chakra, as I explained. Everyone has a divine I am presence. It's known by many names, the divine monad. And Jesus taught his followers and his disciples how to access that power, which is really the power of God, which is the power of the true self, which the sons and daughters of God on earth actually have and possess. So, given that power, given the ability to access that power and love and wisdom, mankind would then be in a position to be Christs on earth, to have access to the Christhood, and instead of having Jesus or Krishna or several saints manifest Christhood, you would have thousands and eventually millions of people manifesting Christhood. That does not necessarily mean that they would be walking on water or anything like that, but that they would have the mind of God, as St. Paul said, let this mind be in you, which was in Christ Jesus. So the church fathers, I conclude, were really not willing to share power, and it was a power trip, if you will. We do not want the true teaching of Jesus, and this remains to this very day. We do not want the true teaching of Jesus manifested on earth. And you might say, why? Why wouldn't they want it? Well, power, lack of control, and of course then I get into this idea of the doctrine of the fallen angels in embodiment who were cast out of the heavenly realms probably millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and have infiltrated not only the Christian church but other walks of life. The fallen angels, the watchers, the Nephilim. And this is a part of the documents that are constantly found, in the Nag Hammadi library as well as in the Bible itself. Jesus actually has a confrontation with these embodied fallen ones in the Gospel of John. We have the story of Revelation, the Archangel Michael casting the Luciferians or Lucifer out of heaven and so forth. My conclusion is that, yes, there are fallen angels on earth, and they definitely do not want the true doctrine of Jesus taught, and that, of course, would include the pre-existence of the soul, the reincarnation of the soul until it is perfected.
But with that said, I mean, think about the impact that has on society. How many people and no mean cards and letters are where I think Joseph and I are going to end up going tonight. But think about all of the millions of people who run around, with their blinders on saying there is no after, you just go to heaven. There is no reincarnation. We can't connect with God individually, blah, blah, blah. All the stuff that you've already started to talk about. And they have been deceived for thousands of years.
Yes,
I mean, basically, for 1,800 years.
Well, that's
killed
why
and all
I was
kinds of
so
stuff.
determined to get back to one of your earlier questions to write this book, because I make a plea at the end of the book, which you probably read, to all Christians to simply, at least read the documents, if nothing else. Read the documents that I used to research. Realize that Christianity is far deeper than the church fathers and the churches today are actually telling the people, like original sin. And, you have two people, Adam and Eve, and there was nobody else on the earth. And, they disobeyed and ate the so-called apple. And now the rest of the human race is doomed to perdition, so to speak. It's one of the teachings that are the false teachings, and I don't count that as authentic. But yes, you're absolutely correct. I mean, it was a deception, and in one of the scriptures, I think it's the book of Revelation, these so-called fallen ones are known as the arch-deceivers of mankind.
But that would also imply that the church...
You have to know what the deceptions were. You have to know who you really are in order to defeat them, because when most of humanity realize that they've been duped, as you say, they will then withdraw their support from the so-called seed of the wicked. And these are the words that are used in the Bible by Jesus, the tares among the wheat, and the seed of the wicked, and so forth. These various names, the godless, the vipers, the serpents, we have Jesus as well as John the Baptist saying, "You brood of vipers." They came up there and to question Jesus and John the Baptist, and of course he was beheaded, as we all know. So you see, it puts a different light on, really. Jesus was executed by the fallen ones, in embodiment. And they're, of course, in every race and every creed throughout the earth, having been cast out. So, yes, you're right. They've been duped. And that is one of the reasons why, this book was written, and other books that I used for reference, such as Fallen Angels and the Origins of Evil by Elizabeth Clare Prophet. I used that book because that's the whole book of Enoch that is reprinted and translated in there. And you begin to see that there's this whole scenario, even with Jesus himself living to a much older age, like some 50 years after the resurrection.
Okay,
again, yes,
I have one question. Then we're going to come back to that topic because I had some questions about that. But I want to kind of finish up on this whole church conspiracy. I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that, and I'm going to use these words because I can't think of a better way to phrase it, that the church, or even like the Pope, is like the Antichrist because he is the one that is perpetuating this lie.
Yes, and some of the ministers, the popes, the cardinals and the ministers are not aware. They've closed their minds. They are dogmatic. Some of them are sincere but ignorant. So I wouldn't necessarily always say that. And some are definitely knowing. Some of them are in a state of absolute rebellion. If you were to walk up to some bishop, cardinal, or minister and say, I've lived before. Origen of Alexandria, the church father, has taught that we have lived before. He wrote about it, and of course he was condemned as a heretic. They would reject it. And partly that is dogmatic, and some of them are actually in a state of absolute rebellion against the truth. I hate to say it. And some are just sincere but deceived by dogma.
Well, I mean, that's how they keep you in line, is all that dogma. I have to tell you, the chat room's going crazy. Yay. We like when the chat room's busy. I guess they're liking you. You're getting a lot of very good comments in there. So, okay, so let's move on to this whole Jesus didn't die on the cross. And okay. I mean, there was the one movie that came out, and I can't remember what the name of the movie was, but Jesus doesn't die, and him and Mary take off, and they go to France, and they live out their life, and that was extremely controversial. And so you coming back and saying, well, Jesus didn't really die on the cross, so tell me what happened, and what do you think happened to him, or what didn't happen to him, as the case may be?
Holger Kirsten, in his book Jesus Lived in India, does say that Jesus did not go through an actual death, but simply was in a state of being drugged and then was resurrected. And I produce all of his findings in my book. But my personal feeling is that Jesus had a certain initiation that he went through. And that initiation could very well have been what we might term clinical death. In other words, the divine spark, which is sometimes called the threefold flame, in the heart, may have been withdrawn, and Jesus may have experienced death. However, his consciousness retained a continuity of consciousness. He then was required, as an initiation, to re-enter the body, to call the flame back and reanimate the body. So it's a moot point as to whether Jesus actually, quote, died, or whether he was in another state that you might term cataleptic. You can make a good argument for that as well. I personally, and this is my and I do state this in the book, after having reviewed other theories of Jesus, for instance, not really dying, that as an adept, I feel that he did go through what you might term death and resuscitated the body. But when he did that, he filled it with, you might call, the resurrection flame, and I talk about the resurrection flame in this book, reanimated the body. And when he appeared to his disciples, his body was not quite the same, and he was trying to tell them, what you're seeing is my etheric body. Now, as you know, and we all probably do know who follow esoteric thought, that we don't have just a physical body. I mean, there's the physical body, there's the astral body, there's the mental body, and there's the highest called the etheric body. Well, the etheric body is really our real body, and it's more real and more solid than matter, than the matter body, which of course decays and rots and gets diseased. So Jesus came back in a physical body congruent with the etheric body. I know that's kind of strange and out there, but he was trying to show there is a continuity of consciousness. This resurrection which you're seeing is capable of, everyone can experience it. It doesn't mean that you have to die. It means that you can invoke the resurrection flame. You can get that wonderful divine spark expanded, and you would be considered a resurrected being on earth. But you see, he allowed himself to be crucified or executed by the fallen ones. Why? For judgment I am come, he said. The judgment was sealed upon these fallen angels for executing the Messiah and the avatar of the age. And within all their subsequent reincarnations, these fallen ones are judged. You see, they have this judgment upon them.
Okay, so we're getting a little confused, and there's a couple of comments in the chat room, and I'm a little confused.
Of course, you see this happening throughout, history.
But I have a couple of a question. So you said that he died, kind of, and I could see where he went into some other state or had a near-death experience. That would be a contemporary word that we could put onto it, where he fooled them enough that he was dead, quote unquote. They put him in the tomb. Yes. I get that part. Two pieces I don't understand. I don't really understand what you mean by resurrection, And then there was a question in the chat room, and I also kind of have the same question. So did he have a physical body, Was he more of an astral body that was able to become like kind of almost interdimensional, where he could become corporeal at times? I'm a little confused there.
Okay, and I know that my personal conclusion and understanding is that he came back in a physical body. He resuscitated the physical body, but it was a glorified body. That's why when Mary Magdalene tried to touch him, he says, "Touch me not, for I have not yet ascended. My energy is still in the physical, and I'm vibrating at a very high rate." So my understanding is that, yes, he came back in a body and lived to an older age, and I realize that there are books and movies and so forth that say he went to southern France, and I'm not saying he didn't. I'm more of the of opinion that he went to Kashmir, India, after he closed his Palestinian mission, and the close of that mission was a levitation on the Mount of Olives, and of course in my book I say that he did return many times and had a mission that was now more or less secret, but then lived to an older age.
So you don't buy he went to France and the whole, Grail is really the bloodline of Jesus, and he went with Mary Magdalene. You don't buy into that storyline? I am not discounting the fact that Jesus may have gone to France. I feel that he settled in Kashmir from the texts, I read, and this is what I write about in the book, where he went through his final, samadhi, or his final ascension, 50 years or 45 years after he was crucified. I'm not denying the bloodline. I just don't, from what my research is giving me, and I just see that there are two different scenarios about Jesus, and I find more convincing the Kashmir scenario. That's not to say that Mary Magdalene didn't make a trip to France. That's not to say that Jesus did not visit France, but I think he settled in Kashmir. And it's possible, and I personally really respect someone that takes the time to read the documents and look at the documents and not just reiterate what somebody else said because somebody else said it because they made it up kind of thing, or because somebody else said it and they just, well, you see a lot of that, so from a, writer myself, I appreciate you taking the time to look at that and look at the documents. All right, but I'm going to change gears here real quick, and I'm going to read, this was on page 27, and I'm kind of going, I'm staying on topic, but I'm going off topic here a little bit, and hopefully I can read this good because I don't read real well. And so this was from the Pistis Sophia, and it says, "It came to pass, there came forth behind him a great light power, shining most exceedingly, and that light power came down over Jesus and surrendered him entirely, while he was seated removed from his disciples, and he had shone most exceedingly, and there was no measure for the light which was on him. Then Jesus ascended and soared into the height, shining most exceedingly in an immeasurable light, and the disciples gazed after him, and none of them spoke until he had reached into heaven, but they all kept in deep silence." And then I guess it goes on. It says that he comes back the next day. But what seems really weird to me with this whole thing, and this is a little off your topic, but I'm going to throw it out because I was just like, get out of town, which is why I really need to go back and read that Pistis Sophia. It sounded like he was abducted. Alien abduction, the ship comes over and he goes up in the light beam thing. Have you ever looked at any of these texts from that perspective? Was there something else going on with him as well?
In my estimation, I don't equate this with any kind of alien abduction. That's my personal opinion. Jesus was very spiritual. The aliens, I don't really trust most of them. They are very advanced races. They appear to be spiritual, but it's a semblance of spirituality. I can well see that from reading the passage, you would conclude that. But the light power comes from much higher realms. The various UFOs and the people that are in UFOs and their home planets and so forth are basically confined to the physical, the astral, the mental, and the very low etheric plane. They cannot navigate any higher into the spiritual realms. Those who are, for instance, only using technology and using various other forces that you might call psychic, as opposed to spiritual. So I would not interpret it in that way.
Okay. All right. Going back to this resurrection thing. I mean, one of the things that I find interesting is that these stories of a death and a resurrection is something that you find in mythology around the world. And actually, I was reading this one book. The book was about the historical nature of fairy tales, and basically the guy's point was, if you take this story over here and you look at the different aspects, you can probably trace back where these different elements of a story came from, because they weren't necessarily part of this story, but they were part of the storytelling. And his point was here, this is better. They have this person, but they don't have the whole history of this person. So to kind of flush them out, they would add these pieces in. Do you find in the Jesus story that there are, and I'm going to say, mythological elements that are added into his story to kind of flush him out, that parallel mythological stories that we find in other cultures?
To the extent that, yes, to the extent that Jesus followed a certain ritual of initiation, which was followed by, in a mythological way with Osiris and Mithras and several other ancient gods and the mystery religions that talk about death and resurrection. The understanding of death and resurrection is very, very ancient, thousands and thousands and thousands of years before Jesus. And it's an archetypal pattern of spiritual initiation and the stages that the soul goes through. So he was simply outpicturing or acting out publicly many of those initiations that were embedded in mythology. He was not the first to go through a death and resurrection. These are very holy initiations. For instance, in Christian terminology, these initiations that Jesus went through, would be called the spiritual birth, the baptism, the transfiguration, the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension. All people following the path of Christ would be required to go through those initiations. It doesn't necessarily mean that they would have to be executed. It just means that they would go through, for instance, what I describe as the dark night of the soul and the dark night of the spirit, where you are cut off from your God presence completely, and you have to make it by the externalized light of the inner threefold flame. So yes, way back in mythology, I don't necessarily adhere to the fact that someone superimposed that on Jesus that he didn't experience. I think he experienced it fully and simply said, look, these are the initiations which you must go through. I'm showing you what they are. You have to follow me in the same way if you want to get back to God. In other words, if you want to get back to the ascended state, if you want to overcome your karma, for instance, and stop the cycle of reincarnation.
But, in most spiritual traditions, there is this concept of a death, a death of the soul, not necessarily death of the body, to kind of close one door and open the next door, even in your spiritual growth, where the death of the ego. I mean, there's lots of parts of us that could die to help us to move forward.
Yes, and that's why St. Paul said, I die daily. It's exactly, you're describing exactly what St. Paul stated and experienced. It is the continuous death of the ego Not that I would impute an actual human ego to Jesus because, he had so much karma balance before he came into embodiment. But he was an avatar, But yes, it's a daily process of death and resurrection. And then there's, of course, the final initiation, which it's done in stages. Every single day, you balance more karma. Every single day you grow more godlike, Yes, absolutely.
All right, I'm shifting gears here again because we had a great question in the chat room. What do you think about the Shroud of Turin? Real, not real?
I happen to feel that it is very real. I believe that it is an actual picture of Jesus going through the crucifixion. I mean, after the crucifixion, yes, I do believe it is real.
And I'm just going to throw out any thoughts on how it could have been created?
Well, of course, there's always a theory that it was imprinted by the power of Jesus during the resurrection. It may or may not have been done that way. It may have been imprinted after they wrapped him up, in those various garments, burial garments. I get the feeling that it was a wonderful little gift. It was a gift that he gave to his followers, a very precious gift to have his picture. I cannot, obviously, you're dealing here with very occult or hidden laws. You're dealing with a very advanced esoteric science that Jesus was privy to, that he was able to bring about with the help of various angelic beings and so forth. Much in the same manner as, the tilma of Mary is shown on Our Lady of Guadalupe. That picture has been analyzed, and it's in many different ways, and it's considered almost miraculous. Well, there are sciences, spiritual sciences, that we don't really appreciate. So I can't really absolutely say how it was done.
It just makes me wonder, like Moses went to the top of Mount Sinai, and when he descended the mountain, he was radiant. And I wonder if in Jesus going through this death and resurrection process, if he too wasn't radiant, from being imbued with, God's energy, and that might have been what created the image on the cloth.
It certainly could have been. Absolutely. That's a very good point. Yes. I'm sure it could have been. And Moses, of course, is an illustration of that. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I would.
No, go ahead. So, what do you think? I mean, I'm looking at the clock. We have about 15 minutes left. What do you believe was Jesus? I mean, you've touched on this, but what his original message was that they wanted to get rid of, that they wanted to so desperately cover up?
Well, Jesus, of course, came for many reasons, one of which was to confront the dark seed, the seed of darkness, whatever you want to call them, the fallen angels, the watchers, and Nephilim, to confront them with light, to judge them, to put them in their place. The other, one of the other reasons for his coming, as you know, it's stated in various texts that Jesus, quote, died for our sins, or that he is the propitiation for sin. And I understand sin as karma, negative karma, which had been accumulating for thousands of years. And this particular karma was about to descend when Jesus stepped in and said, this karma that many, many among humanity have, going all the way back thousands and thousands of years, planetary karma, I will come down and make the difference, and I will hold it back for a time. I will give opportunity to people to accelerate on the spiritual path. So therefore, I am the propitiation. I will volunteer to stand between mankind and their karma. And if they accept me as guru, as Lord, as Savior, I will reignite that flame in the heart and reconnect them to their Christ self, their higher self, which many among mankind lost because of very severe karma. And I'm talking about karma that goes back before recorded history that people don't really know about. And as well as the karma that the Israelites, for instance, had in the Old Testament that Paul speaks about in his letters. So this is found basically in Paul's epistles. Jesus took upon himself planetary karma. And in certain cases, he just reconnected people with their Christ self. But the point of initiation was you had to have the humility to say, I accept you as the Savior. Reconnect me. Then that is the beginning, you see. The belief in Jesus, as the Christians speak, is the beginning of the path. From that point, you then walk the path and accelerate. So to me, that was one of the reasons why Jesus came, one of the most important reasons.
But is it a belief in Jesus or a belief and a following of his message that was important? I mean, do you think that Jesus was looking to create this cottage industry that we have now? Or do you think he was really more interested in people reconnecting with God and reconnecting with themselves?
He was more interested in them reconnecting with God. But you see, if your karma is so heavy that you lost the connection to the higher self, any guru or avatar, Jesus or Krishna, would be able to reconnect you. But you have to make obeisance. You have to believe or trust in that guru. And he will reconnect you to what you've lost. You see, this is all explained in different ways in Paul's epistles. But yes, the end result is you then, after having been reconnected by the help of Jesus, you then pursue the path of spirituality. You pursue your own ascension. The Christians make it sound, at least the Orthodox Christians make it sound like Jesus ascended and nobody else did. Well, when in reality, every single soul can go through the ascension process and end reincarnation, end re-embodiment, and go back to their true spiritual being. And of course, this gets back to the understanding that we pre-existed the body. And many of us were in spiritual realms. I'm not talking about, planets with UFOs now. I'm talking about spiritual realms of Earth, higher forms of matter, spiritual levels. And many souls came down. Some of them came down to volunteer and take incarnation, and some were drawn away because of desires and so forth to the Earth. And they got themselves into a big mess, and we have the stories of the fall of the continents of Atlantis and Lemuria, and we have the situations that happen in the Old Testament, thus losing their spiritual faculties. Well, if you lose your spiritual faculties, you cannot get back on the path. That's why the avatars have come periodically. That's my understanding.
Well, and I can kind of wrap my mind around that. I mean, I know that when I have interacted with a spiritual teacher,
yes,
they just carry this energy with them that, I mean, all you need to do is be in the room with them and you're affected by them in a very positive and loving and healing way. And so I could see, where we could each experience a death of the soul to let that karma or let that energy or let that belief or thought or whatever that thing is move through us, pass through us.
Yes.
Interesting.
It's a very deep subject.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of goes in a lot of different ways. And, and I mean, I'm going through and I'm like, oh man, this thing is just like jam packed, and I got to squish this all into an hour. So, and I just want to say to the people listening, you know, if this is a topic that you're interested in, you really need to get the book, because we are so skimming the surface of this topic. Wouldn't you say, Joseph?
Yes, I would say so. Yeah.
I mean, skimming the surface of this.
Very good. I've been enjoying the questions tremendously, and you've given me the opportunity to speak to many, many good points, and I'm very, grateful for that.
Well, we're not done. I still have you for another 5+ minutes. So I'm going to ask this, because we were talking about Jesus, and we talked about, up until they pretty much canonized the Bible. But what's happened in the church from that point in time to the present? Because it seems like there has been a lot more, can I say, manipulation that's happened in the church doctrine, even taking it away from what was even in those first 4 books.
First 4 books, you mean the 4 centuries, you mean?
Well, I mean, between, the Council of Nicaea, where they canonized the books of the Bible, and we had the canonical Bible, and then the present, we had to go through the Dark Ages, and it just seems to me that there have been a lot of changes, maybe a lot of interpretation changes that have happened even from the 3rd century to now. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that you're right, and most of my research is trying to show how we got to the Council of Nicaea. I didn't go into great depth after Augustine, and for instance, you had the Dark Ages coming upon the earth because of the suppression of knowledge and the suppression of the esoteric teachings, and they went underground. And really, we never actually recaptured, except in the esoteric schools that were founded, like Theosophy, the Summit Lighthouse, the various esoteric schools, finally brought out Jesus' original message, and the story about the Gnostics, and really what Jesus came for. So I think that the councils continued. First it was the writings of the church fathers like Justin, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Augustine, and Jerome. I have a chapter on Augustine, and he's in the, the 400s, the 3 and the 400s, in the 4th and 5th centuries. And of course, he comes out and just totally disparages, Origen and Gnostic teachings. And then we have original sin, and if a baby doesn't get baptized, they're damned to hell eternally. All that nice kind of stuff. But the councils continued, and what we saw is the Dark Ages. And again, it's because knowledge was stricken out. You just had the church now gaining the power of the Roman Empire, merging with the Roman Empire. The popes now are like the emperors that originally persecuted the Christians. And so you have the merging of church and state. So therefore, they had all the power, and they could suppress whatever they wanted. And of course, we all know that the Inquisition, occurred, and that happened, with the Cathars in southern France, where they were exterminated by the Pope, and it just got worse and worse. And nothing really ever went back to the original enlightenment of Jesus, the original teaching. It still has yet to be, in the mass consciousness, although there are many, many, many people in the world that are aware of what we are, discussing, more than ever before, actually.
So in all of this, do you feel that, because one of the basic tenets of Christianity as a whole is that Jesus is the only Son of God. So is that something that you believe in? Or is it something that you just kind of put to the side? Because my feeling is that there are the teachings of Jesus, which are one thing, and then there is a belief in that Jesus was the only Son of God, which is where I kind of get hung up personally. It's like, well, he was a nice guy, and sometimes I live in Texas, so they look at you really weird sometimes when you say that. But what's your thought on that?
I do not believe that Jesus is the only Son of God, but I think that the statement came out as a misinterpretation. The only begotten Son, or the only Son, or the Son, is Vishnu. It is God's divine mind, individualized for each person. So there's one Son. We have Brahma, or the Father. We have Vishnu, the Son, or the only begotten Son. That is the mind, the intelligence of God. And we have the Holy Spirit, or Shiva, in the East. And so this Son individualizes itself through the process of creation in each person. Jesus merged with that Son, or the Logos, which means the Word, or the divine reason, or the universal Christ. Is that explaining it?
Mm-hmm. So there are some people that believe that Jesus was an avatar, the ninth,
yes.
I guess he would be the ninth avatar. Do you think that
yes,
that's true?
And he may have been the only, quote, Son of God in terms of the only avatar at that time during his life, because avatars don't come, every 2 weeks or every year or every few years.
Right.
So the idea of Jesus as the only begotten Son is a misinterpretation of what I've just tried to explain. And it isn't easy to explain it, of course, but there's one universal Logos, there's one universal mind. That mind is individualized. If you can become that mind on an individual basis, then you are the Son of God. And even in the ancient mystery religions, the term Son of God was given to initiates who had passed the final initiation, you see. They were called Son of God. But you see, the fallen ones he's the only one. Don't even try to follow Jesus. He's the only Son, the only one who went up in heaven and ascended, the only one that had a virgin birth and didn't have a natural birth. So they make sure, you see, through the dogma and the doctrine, the fallen angels, that is, make sure that no one, absolutely no one, can be like Jesus or even follow him. You see that? It's amazing.
Well, I think it's really interesting, and I think the points that you make are really on point. Even without having the supporting documents and how things have ended up, people will read the Bible and just kind of spout it out at you. All right. How much time do you have? I can tell the story. So I made a little video called the truth about the Nephilims, and I put it on YouTube. And all of the haters were all of these hardcore, I only read the Bible people, and maybe they read the Book of Enoch, maybe. The more open-minded ones. And they were the biggest haters. And I'm like, wait a minute, I thought you were Christian. Where did all this hate part come in? And I just feel like there's a big discrepancy between living the life of Jesus, which I feel if you are going to be a Christian, you should do, and saying you are, but not living Christian life.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
What would Christ do? Not that. Anyway.
Well, Jesus was well aware of the Nephilim. He was well aware of the fallen ones. He was well aware of the Watchers. Even in Genesis 6 it says, and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and even afterward when, the sons of God resorted to the daughters of men and so forth. So Jesus was, a great, great, great scholar.
Mm-hmm.
He knew Greek, he knew Sanskrit, he knew Pali, he knew many, many languages, and he knew the Book of Enoch, backwards and forwards.
Joseph, I'm looking at the clock, and we did not have enough time to... I just really appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge, and I'm just going to tell everybody that's listening that they should just buy the book. And I don't say that very much. They should just buy the book because it's just jam-packed. So if somebody wants to get a copy of The Orthodox Christian Conspiracy, How Church Fathers Suppressed Original Gnostic Christianity, where can they go to go get that?
Well, I would say to Amazon.com.
Okay.
I mean, it is on the Barnes & Noble, on the computer. It's on the Barnes & Noble website. It's Amazon, and the publisher of the book has a website called Buy Books on the Web. You better get a better deal at Amazon.
Okay, yeah, they have everything on sale right now. Joseph, I'm going to have to let you go. Thank you so much for coming on and talking with us and sharing your insights and wisdom. I really appreciate it. The chat room was crazy. They were loving you. So thank you. All right. Bye-bye. That's Joseph Macchio. His book is The Orthodox Christian Conspiracy, How Church Fathers Suppressed Original Gnostic Christianity. And then next week we have Justin McClellan coming on talking about technology, Star Trek and beyond. And in the second hour we're going to have Tricia Kelly come on talking about conscious parenting. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to